Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. When it comes to foreign policy, the key question facing the new Biden administration is how to deal with China. At this stage, it's hard to say what it will do, but it is possible to say a lot more about China's view of America and the world. And much of that comes down to one person, Xi Jingping, China's paramount leader. Our aim here is to look at how China has been reshaped under Xi's leadership and how China now sees its role in the world. To help us explain all of that, we're joined by Professor Steve Tsang, Director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Professor Tsang, welcome back.
Delighted to be back.
Thank you very much for joining us. We had a really good conversation with you last time when we talked about China and the South China Sea, the Taiwan and the South China Sea. But we're going to look more broadly at China's foreign policy, but also particularly the Communist Party under Xi Jinping. But before we do that, can we just talk about the Premier himself? What do we know about him? Where does he come from? And how did he come to be the leader of the CCP?
Well, Xi Jinping is now the most powerful leader in China, in the People's Republic of China, which came into existence in 1949. And he's the most powerful leader since the founding leader, Mao Zedong. Now, Mao was in control of China from 1949 to 1976 when he died. And under him, China was a classic totalitarian state. That was as powerful as Mao was. Xi Jinping has not made China back into a totalitarian state, but he is practically as powerful as Mao was. He was born to one of the first generation revolutionary leaders of the Communist Party, somebody by the name of Xi Zhongxun. So in the Chinese terms, he is called a princeling, a kind of and he certainly feels that he had the right to inherit the authority from Mao. Now, he worked his way up through the Communist Party hierarchy. Before he became leader, he projected an image that he was very easygoing with his colleagues, that he would keep to himself most of the time and work with his colleagues, and therefore really was no threat to anybody. That was, of course, until he became leader in 2012. At that point, Xi Jinping completely changed. Now, he simply came out and asserted his authority and immediately launched something called the anti-corruption campaign. Talking about anti-corruption and not much else. So most people in China welcomed it because there was a lot of corruption in the Communist Party in the reform period, so they want to see that being changed. People in the Communist Party were a lot less keen about it, but then they thought, all right, a new leader comes in, he's going to have an anti-corruption campaign for 6 months to just sort of put his markers down, then he'll get back to normal. So let's just sort of tolerate it for 6 months. 6 months came and passed. No, Xi Jinping was for real. Now, why that commitment to anti-corruption was so important? Because with the anti-corruption campaign, Xi Jinping introduced something that Mao Zedong did, which was called a party ratification campaign, which really means clearing the party of bad leaders. Bad leaders, what is the worst? The leaders who do not follow the supreme leader are the bad ones. And given the Chinese system, pay their leaders very little money. Believe it or not, Xi Jinping's official annual salary is less than $30,000 US. So everybody at the very senior level in China could be got on some basis of corruption. So that gave Xi Jinping the capacity to clear away the other leaders within the system that could challenge him. And so, but within 5 years, he fully consolidated his positions and made himself the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, to the extent that he even introduced Xi Jinping thought into the Communist Party constitution and into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping is now effectively China.
As you say, he's clearly established his rule at the top. He has really established the primacy also of the Communist Party within China. He's eliminated any competition from his enemies. Could you also talk about the increasing control, perhaps more authoritarian control within Chinese society, but also talk about the sort of one China policy in terms of China's sort of peripheral, minorities. We talk about Tibet, we could talk about the Uyghurs, we could also talk about Hong Kong as well.
The party is incredibly important to Xi Jinping. Now, again, forgive a bit of a jargon. The Communist Party of China is a Leninist party. It was created by Lenin in the Soviet Union, adapting Marxism into something that was effectively organized. A Leninist party is the most powerful instrument of control human history has ever seen. Now, the effectiveness of the Leninist party before Xi Jinping was being weakened because of corruption and because of the reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping. You couldn't control so much if you were opening and making changes. Now, Xi Jinping said, yes, we continue to have reform, but it's my brand of reform, and that reform has to be done with the Communist Party re-establishing very effective control over what? That's easy. Xi Jinping said very clearly. Doesn't matter whether it's north, south, east, west, or in the middle. Doesn't matter it is about party, state, military, intelligence, schools, hospital, or anything. Everything are under the control of the Communist Party. And this is what Xi Jinping is taking the country in terms of direction of travel. One very important effect of this change is that the Communist Party now effectively comes under the control of one man, whereas before Xi Jinping consolidated came to power in 2012, in the previous 30 years of reform and opening, the Communist Party increased the scope for internal policy debates at the senior level. So even though it was still a Leninist party, anti-democratic and all that, people in China could not have democracy, but within the top echelon of the Communist Party, there was a lot of scope for open debate by the senior people within the party. Now that's now closed. Now you do what the boss says and you try to think what the boss, Xi Jinping, thinks. With this, you have this very expanded version of the One China policy. One China policy has been in existence in China since 1949 when the PRC was founded. It was originally being put in place because the old government in China under China's wartime leader Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to Taiwan, and with the start of the Korean War, the Chinese military could not cross the Taiwan Strait and take Taiwan. And so Taiwan was able to continue to exist separately, and China then therefore say we have a one China policy, that this other China, the Republic of China in Taiwan, is also part of China. Xi Jinping goes way, way beyond that. I mean, he doesn't really, in a sense, call it one China policy, but the spirit is that within China, not only places like Taiwan or other disputed territories that China has with other countries, whether it's Japan or Korea or India or other countries, they will all be part of China. even people, the minorities in China, must now be proper Chinese. You cannot just be a Tibetan and Chinese. You cannot be Uyghur and Chinese. You have to be Chinese. And this is a very significant departure from even the Mao Zedong era, not to say the Deng Xiaoping era when things were much more relaxed. It means that if we are looking at Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs people live, yes, government policy under Xi Jinping is that Uyghurs can be Uyghurs, there's no problem. You can be Muslims, that's no problem. The only thing is that you will have to eat pork, drink alcohol, shave your beard, not read the Quran. And you can be Tibetans, absolutely fine. You just have to denounce the Dalai Lama, or at least not follow the Dalai Lama. There is a perfectly good alternative. There is a Chinese guided reincarnated Panchen Lama. Love the Panchen Lama, love the party, love Xi Jinping, then you can be Tibetan. There is a very good example of minorities being very, very good. They are called the Manchus. Remember the Manchus, the ethnic group that used to rule China for nearly 300 years before China became a republic in 1912. Now, Manchus are great because if they don't tell you they're Manchus, you wouldn't know. They look like Chinese now, they eat like Chinese, they behave like Chinese, they think like Chinese, they love the party, they love Xi Jinping. Just be that.
Steve, I wanted to go through all of this because I think it's very important to understand the changing dynamic within China before we come on to how China views the rest of the world. And so this is where we shift now. Now, inevitably, we look at China in commercial terms. We look at the huge exchange of technology and trade that all countries throughout the world have with China. So we are deeply embedded economically with, working and trading with China. Can you talk a bit about how Xi Jinping views this global order? And perhaps maybe we can, just by way of looking at the Silk Road strategy, which is something that predates him, but how does he view that sort of continuum of the expansion of Chinese power and trade abroad?
Xi Jinping loves globalization. As long as globalization is good for China, and good for China means it's good for the Communist Party, or at the top of which stands Xi Jinping. And if globalization happens to be not so good for China, that particular bit of globalization may be a bit problematic. Now, what does it mean in practice? Xi Jinping became leader in 2012. In 2013, he issued a confidential document to the Communist Party. Somebody leaked that document to us. And so we now know the full contents of that document. It's called document number 9. And the journalist who leaked this information had ended up in jail to pay for the price of leaking this information. Now, what does the document number 9 say? Document number 9 says that ideas like constitutionalism, like democracy, like civil society, like this distorted Western concept of journalism, like a liberal economic order, neoliberal economic order. Now, all these are prohibited in China anywhere. You cannot mention them, not even in universities. You cannot talk about them. You talk about them, you have committed a crime. You will have to face the consequences. This is the kind of globalization that he doesn't want. He would like to have more technological cooperations, as long as it's technological cooperations that enable China to become much more technologically innovative and effective. And China would also like to be very helpful to the rest of the world, where China is more advanced in cyber governance, for example. They are very happy to write the rules for the international community so that we can always follow the more advanced Chinese version of governance. But if you want to change that, that's the bad kind of globalization. We don't want that.
Can you talk briefly? I mean, I'm very intrigued by on the trade side, the China's deliberate policy of basically stealing technology, and this part of this involves the People's Liberation Army as well. Because I think whilst we acknowledge that China is a rising power, but we tend to think that we should be treating on equal terms, and the US and its allies are understandably peeved when China starts stealing industrial technology, and that its military is responsible for it.
Okay, on the Chinese acquisition of intellectual property by fair or by foul, this is not something that we can blame Xi Jinping for. It is something that they have been doing for at least 40 years, if not longer. In the 40 years of reform and opening, they have been doing it from the very beginning. And at the very beginning, in the 1980s, when they started to infringe on the intellectual property rights of other countries, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and France and others, in fact, were very, very relaxed about it. I mean, China was so far backward. China in the 1980s is like North Korea today. I mean, that is the kind of things we are looking at. And the Chinese, they will always, in the 80s and to the 90s, always say that, we are infringing intellectual property rights because you price them unfairly. And often you're talking about things like computer softwares. In 80s and 90s, and indeed into much later, nearly all Chinese government departments use pirated versions of your Microsoft or other softwares to power their computers. And they simply say that there's no way a country like China's state of development can pay for your license fee to use them. So if you price them reasonably, we will just buy them. But since you won't, we will steal them. And companies like Microsoft will say, all right, okay, let's forget about China. We will enforce it somewhere else. And basically let that happen. So you have a very long-standing period of that happening with Western governments being very, very complacent about that process. We are now getting worried about it because China is a peer competitor to the United States. China is now rich and powerful. China has a bigger economy than everybody else except the United States of America. And therefore, countries like the UK and indeed the United States would get worried about the intellectual property rights theft. And why would the PLA not be involved in it? The PLA has dedicated unit, special manpower to just do that. And of course, they will be part of that process.
So it's clear that China does not follow Western ideas of the international global order. It's there for its own power, I guess, as any superpower has been beforehand. We'll talk in a moment about how the US and its allies should respond to China. But first of all, how does China see the Biden administration? How does it view America at the moment? And what do you think its strategy is towards the United States?
The Chinese government would have liked a reset in relationship with the United States with the transfer of power from Trump to Biden. The ambassador even said that, or the foreign minister even said that officially, that they would like a reset to happen. What they refused to say was what would they put on the table for the Americans to have a reset? So they basically want to wipe the Trump years and the tension and the bad relationship with the Trump years off and get Biden to restart, and hopefully with a basis very similar to the Obama administration, of which Biden was vice president. This is never realistic because things have changed in the United States. The change in how the United States deal with China is not just a matter of Donald Trump and his very erratic way. It was because of the change in recognition in the US that China needs to be taken seriously, that China poses a threat. Now, the Chinese government under Xi Jinping seriously does not see itself as posing a threat to anybody. If you read the kind of speeches and writings of Xi Jinping, he really would say things like, we believe in big countries not bullying other small countries. We believe that poor countries should be treated well. Now, ask Singapore. It was in 2010 at a ASEAN Regional Forum Summit in Hanoi in 2010, when the Chinese foreign minister at the time was being challenged by the American Secretary of State, who happened to be Clinton, Hilary Clinton. And he was caught off guard and got a bit angry, and in a fit of absence of the mind, he burbled a whole lot of things and said, but there are big countries and there are small countries looking at the foreign minister of Singapore in the eye. And that's just a fact, he said. They don't see the contradiction. They believe that China was not the origins of COVID-19. They believe that China has been very helpful to the rest of the world in the supply of PPE. What you see and read in the Western media are all lies. So they look at themselves as a very good force, and therefore they cannot really get it that the Biden administration is not very likely to return to the way how the Obama administration dealt with China.
Okay. I think people who've been watching this series may have seen your talk on when we spoke about Taiwan and the South China Sea and really how aggressive or expansionist China was becoming there. And we also looked at China's increasing military power. The question, as I say, is how the United States should respond to China. And I think I want to try and get an understanding of what the balance of power is, and also how able the US is to respond to China. If you think about it, we're coming out of a pandemic, or just still in a pandemic. Countries around the world are concerned about their economies that have all plummeted. And I think the last thing anyone wants, particularly in Europe, is some kind of conflict between the US and China. So having given that sort of preamble, how do you see the balance of power between the United States and China at the moment, both in terms of what are China's strengths? It's clearly not as powerful as the United States militarily, but in terms of global trade, it must have enormous powers. How do you see the balance of power between the two? As I'm saying this, please can everyone start putting questions in the Q&A box here, just down here on the right-hand side, so we can start taking your questions and put them to Professor Tsang. But Steve, just give us an idea of what you think the balance of power between the two at the moment are.
Well, at the moment, the balance of power is still very much in the favor of the United States of America. Even Xi Jinping acknowledges that. Xi Jinping, when he became the paramount leader in 2017, actually lay out a plan by which China would be expected to have overtaken the United States by 2050. And that was the last day for that to happen. That was not necessarily a target day. But he was certainly not expecting this to be in the next 5 or even 10 years. And here we're not only talking about the military power, we are talking about the economic power, we are talking about the innovative capacity, we are talking about the whole network of how you compare and compete in the 21st century. It's easy to say that some of the most valuable everyday things we use, high-tech things we use, are all made in China. Your iPhones are all made in China. Your most of your high-tech stuff are made in China. But if you look at the iPhone, it's the classic example that your 1,000 pound iPhone does not have much more than, well, in fact, usually substantially less than $100 worth of value added being added in China. The rest were all American or being sourced somewhere else. So we are still talking about that kind of balance. We're still talking about while one of China's national champions, Huawei, being able to produce cutting-edge 5G technologies that really should have wowed the rest of the world. And yet, if the Americans, as Trump did, say, we will stop American companies supplying chips to Huawei, then Huawei would collapse. And this is the kind of balance we are looking at. And Xi Jinping has a policy, he called it Make in China 2025, which is specifically to make sure that kind of scenarios cannot happen.
So I get a hint, are you advocating that if the world is going to have, if we value the current global order for whatever its faults, and we see China as a threat to it, we have to uncouple our economic dependency on China? Are you saying that?
I'm academic. I don't do advocacy. So I am not advocating one thing or the other. What I am saying is that a key element of Xi Jinping's foreign policy is to make the world safe for authoritarian states. In contrast to American policy since Woodrow Wilson, which was to make the world safe for democracies.
Okay, then let me put the question another way. I mean, are you saying, which I really hinted at earlier, is that are you saying that the countries around, basically you can't put that pressure on China until you begin to uncouple from it economically? I
think we cannot afford to completely disengage with China. Our economies and their economies are now so integrated already. The idea that we completely decouple, I don't think is a realistic one. But there are areas of cooperation that I think we do have to be very worried about. Because at the end of the day, we are looking at a Leninist party state, which is fundamentally anti-democratic, that it subverts human rights, that it plays by its rules, but not other people's rules, and it has a pretty cavalier attitude to international treaties that they have signed. So we have to bear that in mind in terms of what we can cooperate and what we cannot cooperate. And there are a lot of areas which I think we can cooperate with China, and indeed we should cooperate with China. If we don't cooperate with China, for example, we can never tackle the climate change challenges. And the climate change challenge is so big for it.
Yeah, it's a hugely complex situation. There's no simple answers to this. So perhaps my question was a bit simplistic. Nigel Harley's got a question, and then we've got a question from Xu Ji. So let's take Nigel first.
Yes, I think the world's attention seems to be very much on China's maneuvers in the South China Sea. There's obviously the big concerns about Taiwan and what's happening in Hong Kong. But it's not China's real interest on the land. The Belt and Road Initiative, and the whole sort of promotion of relations with the Eurasian group In other words, is that the priority of China's foreign policy?
Steve, that the focus of that is sort of more sort of geographic focus. So does China have a sort of a regional geographic interest in one area as opposed to another? But I think the interesting thing about the Belt and Road Initiative is just the debt that it puts all countries in all around the world and the leverage that gives China.
Okay. In terms of what really are geographically important to China, it is still the near neighbor of China that matters. It is the Hong Kong and the Taiwan and the South China Sea that really matters much more to China than any of the big span of areas from Central Asia through Southern Asia into the Mediterranean and into Africa or into Europe, which is the direction of the Belt and Road Initiative bit. Now, it's very easy to simply talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as a gigantic debt trap for many of the countries that are being involved in the partner projects. I would like to add one more element to it. If we are looking at it as a debt trap, it is also an enormous and perhaps the biggest debt trap for China. Because those projects, some are often problematic and you see them as debt traps because they are projects, infrastructural projects that would not be funded by your longer established international development agencies or World Banks or IMF or ADBs. They would not fund them because they are not very viable. And the Chinese government funding those infrastructural projects, and a lot of them, most of them are actually desperately needed in those countries which want them but can't afford them. So moving forward, give it another 10 years, say, when those loans have all matured and those countries cannot pay back, what would the Chinese government do? They cannot simply go and occupy every one of those countries. There is no plan for that. For all the enormous loans that the Chinese government have made to other countries, poor countries, the only case where the Chinese have taken actual control over a port is in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. We don't have as yet another example apart from Hambantota.
Okay, so you see it as much a potential weakness as it is a strength or leverage.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take Xu Ji. Go ahead, Xu. Do you want to open your microphone? Go ahead, go on.
Hi, Professor Tsang. It's a pleasure to listen to you speak. I'm very interested in your opinion on Xi's grip on power within the country. I mean, he has gone about destroying every one of the potential opponents he has. And in the years we've been watching him since he came to power, he's become increasingly autocratic to the point of maniacal even. I mean, his behavior towards Hong Kong, for example, and the recent saber rattling. You know, China's always saber rattled with Taiwan, but it's become very noisy these days. And the most recent thing that was curious to me was the way the Alibaba IPO was suddenly just, canceled. And I saw a recent report that suggests part of the reason he wanted to do that was because a number of the people involved in that IPO are potential opponents who are Jiang Zemin's descendants and people like that. So how much opposition do you think there is in China, in the party, to Xi? Because not everybody's happy with him there.
Very, very good question. Xi Jinping is genuinely very popular in China as a whole. He is not quite as popular within the Communist Party. He is even less popular the more high up you get within the Communist Party. But would any one of them dare to openly challenge him? No. Not even for the elite other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. Before Xi Jinping, there was an unspoken rule in the Communist Party after Mao, which was that if you became one of the very top leaders as a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, usually either 7 or 9, you have in effect immunity whatever you may have done or whatever you may do. You are untouchable. And your families too. In office or in retirement, no difference. Xi Jinping took down one of a really hated figure, a corrupt man called Zhou Yongkang, a year or so after he retired as Politburo Standing Committee member. That completely changed everything. Nobody in the party is safe. The more senior you are, the more vulnerable you are. So you get into this very ridiculous situations that, yes, we know there are significant unhappiness within the Communist Party leaders. We don't know exactly how extensive it is because you cannot gauge that. The funny thing is, if you are so senior as being, say, one of the top 200, therefore a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, you cannot meet one-on-one with another member of the Central Committee. One-on-one meetings is prohibited because you can plot. You can have a meeting of several Central Committee members because there's somebody else who is going to rat on you. So that effectiveness of that control, I think, is very, very tight. Xi Jinping is genuinely very powerful, and his paranoia doesn't mean that he is very weak. It means that he is doing everything to make sure that all the instruments are in place to keep his colleagues in line, even more than keeping your average Chinese citizens or your dissidents in line.
Fascinating, fascinating. Thank you very much for that. A great question. Let's go to Jonathan now. Jonathan, you can hear me. Just go ahead. Go on.
This is a very good discussion. I really appreciate it. There's a part of China's self-belief that we've been seeing that seems to want to go back to times of old when China was the center of the world and the emperor was controlling everything very close to China, but not necessarily further away. Is that realistic in this world we live in?
I just want to add to that, Steve, if I can. I mean, is there a sense of destination that many Chinese people or policymakers would see? Is there, this is China's rightful place in the world. They were, way ahead in terms of technology, invented this, that, and the other. Is there, in the sort of mindset of the Communist Party, a destination where they want to be at?
Very good questions. First of all, I don't think there is such a thing as what people of China want. We don't know what they want. Well, we are always being told what the Chinese people want. That's basically what one man wants. What he wants is what everybody else must want. The China dream is what Xi Jinping says it is. You, as a citizen of China, may want whatever you want. It's got nothing to do with it. Now, when you talk about the so-called rightful place of China, it really depends on what Xi Jinping would see now. If we go back one leader, say to Hu Jintao, or two leaders to Jiang Zemin, I think they would still have wanted China to be the top dog in the world, but not necessarily reinstating the kind of old traditional so-called Tiansha, the all under heaven concept, which is what you describe. China at the center, and then at the peripherals are good barbarians, even further are bad barbarians, wild barbarians, because they're even less civilized. The more closer you are to China, the more civilized you are. And China is being the center of civilization will be good to you all. So we will trade with you, we'll give you advantages and all that. Now, does that concept still work in the 21st century? I don't think so. I think the world has changed. In the system, in the international system we have since the end of the Second World War, no country can enjoy a more significant status than being a veto holding member of the Security Council. And there are 5 of them, not going to be just one. And therefore, one being at the center with everybody else at peripheral is a concept that others will not want to accept. And of course, we are also looking at a very highly complex world in the 21st century where other countries have their capacity, which they can come up. I mean, if we are looking at the United States having been so dominant in the world for so long, and its dominance is now looking wobbly. And that's just because of 40 years of changes in China. Can that not actually happen in somewhere else? If you look at things like demographic trends, China is the most populous country in the world. Therefore, it has the largest economy in the world. You move forward 50 years, China is not going to be the most populous country in the world. If you move forward 100 years with the demographic projection, China would be lucky to be in the top 5. And that will cause a lot of changes. So there's nothing carved in stone as to which country will dominate the world in which way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. China's about to hit a demographic crisis as a consequence of the one-child policy. We've got a question from Paul Jackson, and then we'll take one from Georg Blaha. So, Paul, you go ahead first, Paul.
It's excellent presentations. Thank you very much. You started to be positive. You started to say there are areas of cooperation, and you only gave one, climate change. I imagine there are more, and I was just interested what else they are.
Well, climate change is the obvious one. Other areas where we can cooperate, I think, probably in terms of vaccine development, in terms of how to deal with the pandemic. I think we do want to know how it all started. But at the end of the day, if we are going to put the pandemic behind us, we will all have to work together. We will have to come up with the ways that we go beyond vaccine nationalism, but continue to encourage and support multiple vaccines being developed. And the vaccines that happen to be the most effective at the lowest cost, can be distributed the easiest, needs to be manufactured and distributed most widely. And that can only happen with international cooperation, including China. China is a very major producer of vaccines. They should, at the moment, from my perspective, they should not be bothered with producing the 2 Chinese vaccines that they are distributing. They should be focusing on producing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine under license for it to be distributed as widely as possible at the earliest time. So there are that kind of areas where I think we can look at cooperating.
Okay, Georg Blaha. Georg? Are you there, Georg?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I see your hat and half your face. There we go.
Yeah, it's cold. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Professor Tsang, for the presentation. And I was wondering about the balance of power and the standoff between China and the United States. There is Taiwan as a buffer country, much like the Ukraine in Europe. And I wonder if maybe Japan would be prepared to join a military alliance with the United States. And at the same time, I was also wondering if Taiwan increased its military capabilities, because 10 years ago, I understand there was a talk of good cross-strait relations, and President Ma Ying-jeou phased out conscription, and a lot of people in Taiwan at the time were concerned that the country will lose its defensive capabilities. Can you say something about that?
Steve, it's a good question, because we did see almost a deliberate dismantling of alliances under Trump. So I presume one of the first things the Biden administration is going to do is try and rebuild those alliances in that area and also globally.
Well, that was one alliance that Trump did not dismantle with Taiwan. For all the sins of Donald Trump, he was not making an enormous mess over Taiwan. Perhaps for the wrong reasons, but it was still the right answer. Now, in the case of Taiwan, I think that, and the issues being raised, there are a couple of things we need to bear in mind. Japan already has a defense alliance with the United States of America. Japan takes Taiwan's security extremely seriously. But Japan is constrained by its constitution. Article 9 of the Japanese constitution basically prohibits the Japanese from using war as an instrument of foreign policy. It does not even allow Japan to have a normal military. So the Japanese militaries are self-defense forces, and they are not just in name. Japan operates some of the most advanced fighter jets, like your F-15s or F-35s, except that they don't have the offensive capabilities. They only have the defensive capabilities. They can be changed very quickly, but that is where they are. The expectation will be that if Taiwan were to come under attack, not as a result of something that Taiwan has done, and if the United States will come to Taiwan's assistance under the Taiwan Relations Act of the US, then Japan can be expected to support the Americans in a passive way, meaning that all the American forces based in Japanese territories will be able to be forwardly deployed to engage with the Chinese forces, with the security of the American forces and their base and their personnel being protected by the Japanese forces. And the Japanese anti-missile shields will also cover American forces being deployed on Japanese waters. Now that's the sort of things we can expect the Japanese to do. Beyond that, they are not allowed to do by their own constitution. As to Taiwan's own defense, there is a major change in the way how they think about it and approach it in the last decade. Previously, they were looking at very big ticket items. They want fighter jets, they want submarines, they want major surface combat ships. Now they have learned they can't compete with China on those. They are now looking at asymmetry warfare and area denial. They are looking at building the kind of missile and other capabilities that will make it very difficult and very costly for the Chinese forces to try to take Taiwan. That is not just a shift from Ma Ying-jeou to Tsai Ing-wen as leadership. Even in the Ma administration, they were starting with that process. The change of the conscription service really is a reflection of how the world has changed. If you go back 30 years, a conscript army can be reasonably effective because of the kind of weapons they use were relatively easy to be trained to use. But now a modern military, if you go beyond the army in particular, requires very intensive training before they are operationally effective. That's why most great powers have gone for professional military rather than keeping their conscript elements in the military, because they are not really effective anyway. I mean, one of the things I have learned when I spent time visiting the United States Navy was that why the US Army now do not have private second class any longer. They are called specialists. And they are called specialists because they are trained to do one specific job in the infantry. They are not bright enough to be trained to do many different tasks because they are getting so complex.
Right. So it's a huge endeavor to engage in a sort of conflict of that scale. And the main point you're making was that Taiwan wants to make it more costly than it's worth it for China. We've got quite a few questions to get through. We've just got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to take Jim Lowenstein next. So we'll go to Jim and then Hilary Matthews. So go ahead, Jim.
Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yeah, you're there, yeah.
It's always fascinated me that no one ever talks about Chinese students abroad. In the last student year, not this year, but last year, there were 370,000 Chinese students in the United States. What effect does that enormous number of students who then go back to China have in China and in terms of relations with the United States? Because surely they have absorbed some sense of what America is like when they go back, and it can't. I imagine that all of their feelings aren't hostile.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think there's in terms of both populations, there's an increasingly sort of animus towards each other. So the U.S. population's attitude towards the states is obviously towards China is even more critical. And from what I heard, that's the same within China. The other thing I was going to add to Jim's note is that it's not just sort of private students traveling from China to study abroad. It's also the People's Liberation Army actually sending people to go to US and British universities. Steve, you go ahead and answer the question.
Okay, really good question. There isn't one answer to it because we are talking about an enormous spectrum of people. You still have some Chinese students who went to the United States or the UK or France or Germany who would really understand the host country, and some of them will acquire the values we have. They exist. Are they the majority? Not by a mile. The overwhelming majority of Chinese students in the Western democracies don't really buy into the values of the host country. Now, what has changed is that in the 1980s, when the first wave of students came out of China, they were poor and they have very few Chinese friends. If they don't watch the BBC or ABC, they have not much to watch on telly. If they don't read British newspaper or American newspapers, they don't have much to read. They can wait for a week or two to get a Chinese newspaper being delivered. Occasionally you get something from the Chinatown. But now, they don't watch the BBC. They don't read the Financial Times. They don't read the New York Times any longer. They read Chinese media online. They watch Chinese television online. By being in the democratic countries for their university and other studies, doesn't mean that they have to submerge any longer. In the 80s, the problem with mixing of Chinese students is that they were too poor. They couldn't go out with our kids to the pub for a beer because they couldn't afford to pay for a beer. Now the problem is Chinese students say, well, let's go out and have a meal. Where do we go? Oh, that fantastic, wonderful restaurant. Oh, sorry, can't go, haven't got the budget. It's the Brits, it's the Americans, it's the French who can't afford to go with the Chinese because the Chinese students have spending power that we don't. So we are not having the same level of effect, even though the number have increased enormously.
So basically saying the cultural and educational exchange is marginal, to say the least.
At the moment is marginal, regrettably. And our opening of our doors to senior Chinese military visitors also do not usually have much real effect on changing how they behave. I mean, every year in the United Kingdom, there is a Chinese colonel or senior colonel who would come to the Royal College for Defense Studies for 1 year. They don't end up taking up our values.
Right. I find that surprising in some way, but it's I guess that there it is. Let's go to Victoria Barclay. Go ahead, Victoria, and then Hilary. Victoria, are you there? Go on.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry to go back to Taiwan, but it was, and I was very interested in what you were saying about Japan. But I was wondering, as India is a nuclear power, which is therefore quite, well, potentially threatening, obviously, what if they engaged in diplomatic relations with the United States against China? I mean, how would that work, or is it not even feasible? I'm just thinking of it as a deterrence, diplomatic deterrence to.
It's a really good question, Victoria, because I think you're seeing an increasingly nationalist India. But what does that mean in terms of foreign policy? And certainly, we've seen clashes very recently between China and Taiwan, also China and India on the border there, with people actually physically, having fisticuffs. Steve, what is your perception?
Okay, India is a fantastic case. India is a democracy which is at the moment under a very authoritarian prime minister. So we have a love-hate relationship with India. We want to love India, but sometimes it's very difficult to love. The Indian Modi government developed a remarkably good relationship with Xi Jinping's China until they had the border clash. And suddenly you have a very, very big problem. The Indians have been very concerned with the Chinese for quite a long time now, because they have huge amount of territorial disputes. You're talking about an entire Indian province, which the Chinese claim because of the historic links with Tibet, that the Indians do not acknowledge or accept. And then you have other bits of the territorial border which are very poorly defined, because British India never defined that piece of the border with the Manchu Chinese Empire clearly in the 19th century. Now, how much do the Chinese actually worry about India? Not quite as much as you thought it should. China does not quite see India as a near peer competitor. China sees Japan as a peer competitor. China takes Japan in some ways much more seriously, because Japan is such an enormous economic power. And for all the constraints of the Japanese military, it is extremely capable. The Indians are capable, but the Indians don't have expeditionary capability. So the Chinese are actually not that worried about them.
Thank you.
Right. We've got a question from Hilary Matthews, and then I think we've got David Scott as well. So Hilary, go ahead.
Yes, am I allowed to change my question? I did have a question on.
By all means, change it on.
I was going to ask you about China's commitment to climate change and how real that is, but actually you haven't talked about Hong Kong, and I would like to ask you about how you see the future of Hong Kong going with respect to its relationship with China. Thank you.
Bleak. I'm afraid the future for Hong Kong is very bleak indeed. As far as the Chinese government is concerned, the Chinese government totally 100% fulfills its commitments to Hong Kong in its one country, two systems, and high degree of autonomy promises. Anybody who says the Chinese government is not doing that is anti-Chinese, full stop. Now, what they actually do bear no resemblance to what they claim they actually have done in terms of the promises. They have basically went back on their promises. They will crush any and every attempt in Hong Kong to challenge the authority of the Chinese government, or to challenge the narrative the Chinese government is not fulfilling its commitments to Hong Kong in terms of the one country, two systems. The Chinese government no longer talk about the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, which is the international treaty registered at the United Nations that guarantee Hong Kong's status and system unchanged until 2047. They say that they do it simply because of their own promise. And if you believe in any promises the Communist Party made, well, ask some of the dead, very old senior Communist Party leaders. Ask Liu Shaoqi, the former vice president. Ask Deng Xiaoping. Ask Pang Dehuai. Every one of them can tell you, if you trust the party, you end up like them, in serious trouble.
So it's we could talk about Hong Kong for some time, but there we are with that one that's, as you say, bleak. David Scott, your question, please. Go ahead, David.
Am I on?
Yep.
I think it's a slight change from the question that I originally posed. I don't think major military activity is ever likely because of the fear of what nuclear war will do. And anything that gets started can eventually lead to that. What I see is a China now which is going ahead economically, clearly going to be superior to the United States because it's got its grip on the production of microprocessors, and it's also got its grip on the source of materials for all these special chips now required for more digitization, the rare earth metals. But what I'm more interested in fact, which I come to through my religious connections, is the way in which the internal security operates, to the extent of having facial recognition cameras on virtually every street corner, and a system I understand from what I've read, and that's only what I've read, that there are methods by which you have like a scorebook in which your score is kept, and in which if you step out of line, that means you won't get your pension, or you won't get your pension for a month, or all these sort of very sophisticated punishments and so on. So is there in fact something within the Chinese mentality which will allow that to be maintained, or will it eventually cause trouble?
So, Steve, I think there's a good opportunity to address a couple of things. I mean, we've talked in previous sessions about the technology being used to repress the Tibetans, and it is, as David was just outlining, face recognition technology. You can't go out of your house without actually having to show your face to the camera, and it is possible to control blocks of 500 people and have somebody within the party monitoring the whole population. So there is that very repressive side to it. But the thing I wanted to pick up from David was also that if you have such a repressive system, and if Xi Jinping is looking over his shoulder, he's also prone to making big mistakes as well, both internally and externally. So perhaps we could combine those two questions there. So that you could talk about having conflicts because he's not able to manage a political decision-making process that would have more experts within it. You could have a backlash internally because the system is so repressive, or perhaps not.
Very good questions. I'll go to the issue you raised first, Nicholas. Yes, you are absolutely right that because Xi Jinping concentrates so much power in his hands, and he has now eliminated scope for domestic top-level policy debates, if he gets a policy right, things can happen very effectively and efficiently, as indeed demonstrated in the containment of the COVID crisis after initial problems last winter, spring. But if he get it wrong, God help China. That's absolutely true. The issue that David has talked about, in China, they have a term for it. It's called social credit system. It is what they use to control you. Now, is this something inherent in the Chinese people, Chinese culture, Chinese gene pool that would accept that? With all due respect, absolutely not. Taiwan is a fine example. Taiwan is a normal democracy. You don't need, the only quirkiness of Taiwanese democracy is that it is not Anglo-American style, not Anglo-Saxon democracy. But otherwise, it functions by some measures, it functions more properly as a democracy than the British democracy is because we evolved in a very erratic way, or the American democracy because it's designed more than 20 years ago. A new modern 21st century design works better. So it's nothing with people of the Chinese heritage there. But if you have grown up ever knowing only the Communist Party system in China, you have not been brought up to question the party. You have not been brought up to challenge what is being done. That is the norm. That is what normally happens.
And Steve, at the same time, people would have huge pride, enormous pride in China's colossal economic achievements. And also they see pictures of the Chinese, of the People's Liberation Army, the Navy. There must be a huge sense, my goodness, China really is now on top of the world. So there must be such an enormous sense of national fervor.
You have hundreds of millions of Chinese who would share that view, but we are talking about 1.3 billion people there. Xi Jinping would like to tell you that under Xi Jinping, he has eliminated poverty. You go beyond the coastal cities, you go beyond the main traffic hubs, the big cities, you still have very significant poverties in many different parts of China. They have just been officially eliminated as being counties of poverty by order of the Communist Party, because Xi Jinping has a policy that poverty has to be eliminated. Therefore, poverty has been eliminated. Now, those people don't feel quite so impressed by the pictures we regularly see of the ultra-modern bit of Shanghai or Beijing or Tianjin or Chongqing or Canton. They are not part of it. They don't have a right to live in those places. Traveling to there is not as easy as it should be. If they could travel there, they can't afford it anyway. And if you are really struggling with making a living, are you really all that bothered with those shiny missiles and tanks that got paraded on TV on National Day? Probably really not that bothered with them. I mean, can an aircraft carrier fill your tummy? Can it feed your children with safe baby formula? If you are dealing with everyday challenges that you cannot be sure that the vaccine you have is safe, that the food you feed your children are safe, you may not necessarily feel quite so good about it. So we are talking about a huge range of people in China who have many different feelings. But if you belong to those categories, by and large, the party will make sure that your voices are not being heard, particularly for those feisty Westerners who like to pick on good, heroic, wonderful China, and that image is something that we should all celebrate.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Tsang. That's been a really, really informative talk. We've really covered a huge range of things, and I'm very, very grateful to you for your time. Please do stay with us, everyone. I don't know if Steve can stay with us just for a few moments afterwards. I've got an additional question, but I'm just going to sum up here. It's been a fantastic talk. So my thanks very much indeed to Professor Tsang from SOAS for his time.